Hey, hi, welcome back. This is the third video for Kafka. We were discussing about first two videos. We discussed about introduction to Kafka and then couple of features of Kafka, components of Kafka. This video is about how do you run Kafka in your local environment. We will go kind of a little bit of depth explanation about certain things. So I have got on the screen, actually you can see that I have got a Docker Compose file. So I'm using Confluent in Kafka, which is the latest version of Kafka. The name of the container I gave it as Kafka Kraft. The reason purposely I gave Kraft is there are many Docker Compose files available out there, but most of them are all about Zookeeper mode. But I would like to run Kafka in the Kraft mode, which is the de facto standard, which will be de facto standard going forward. Right. So 9092 is the Kafka default port, and you know that this got to be the port on your host machine, and this got to be the port on your container. This is the port for the controller. I will explain actually all these things, but right now this is my Docker Compose file. All these things are pushed to GitHub, and for sure you would get actually access in the description. Fine. So first I run Kafka. I run Kafka instance. We will have a look at the Kafka instance. After that, uh, uh, I will explain actually a few of these environment variables. Okay, and that way I think it's good. So Docker Compose up. This is the Docker Compose file. Docker Compose off. If you want to run it as a Docker container as well, normally without Compose, you can do that. All these environment variables, either you have to store it in a file and pass it, or you can pass it with the hyphen e if you are aware of Docker. So by this, actually it is expected that you know Docker. If you do not have knowledge in Docker, please learn Docker. So this is Docker Compose mode. uh, and then this particular Kafka instance is one node Kafka instance with the Kraft mode. Okay, only one node. I'm not going to run Kafka with a multiple nodes. This is just a one node. We will see in the future tutorials we may see with the multiple nodes, but this is particularly only one node. So Docker Compose up hyphen d is a detached mode, so that you know all the logs would not be shown. It's silently just up and run. So a network is created. Generally, anytime you create a Docker Compose, it creates a network. There are many benefits of creating its own network for the Compose file. One of the benefits is uh, uh, you know DNS is enabled. Docker basic bridge network never have the basic DNS. Okay, but if you create any Docker Compose, a network is created. Even though you don't create a separate network is created, and then if at all there are multiple containers, they can talk to each other based on the container name, which is also a host name. So DNS search is automatically, DNS resolution is automatically enabled other than basic Docker bridge network. So here a network is created and a container is created. However, we are not using this network, but we are using this container. I will explain these environment variables, but let's see that whether Docker Kafka is running or not. Docker PS. So there is Confluent Kafka. There is Confluent Kafka. A minute ago, it's running. Okay, that's the first thing. So Confluent Kafka is running. Uh, we will see next video how to communicate and then how to write producers and all. Right now, this is only to ensure that the Kafka uh, is running as a container. Okay. So this is running over here. So 9092 is the port on my host machine as well. You want to see what is happening? You could docker inspect. The name of the container is this. So the ID of the container. I can give D6. D6 is the container ID. This is all the container ID, but if there is no repeated letter, I can give two letters, one letter as well. Even in fact, there is nothing starts with the D, I can give D as well. Fine. So this is the IP address of the container. Generally Docker container IP addresses are 172.17.0.1. That is going to be the gateway since it has created its own network. Okay, the IP address got changed because IBM service has created its own network. A IP address management has created addresses with 172.19 series. Okay, you can see that CIDR notation with the 16 /16, and then these are the DNS names. You can see generally for the basic Docker bridge network, these DNS names are not shown. But however, uh, the most important thing which I feel is these are the environment variables. These environment variables are very, very important for Kafka. Okay, all these environment variables actually we have injected. Okay, cluster ID generally whenever you create Kafka, I have created Kafka, I managed Kafka. Uh, okay, I know that actually cluster ID is not generally we give. I managed Kafka as a small Docker Compose or also in Kubernetes service or also using Shimzy Kubernetes operator and also using Confluent. So I know that the cluster ID is pretty tricky here, particularly in the care after mode. Okay, I will list down all these things because I have noted down all these things in a separate document so that it would help you to understand well. Okay, this is the Docker Compose file. I will give you the location. This is the explanation of each and every environment variable. So this particular explanation give you a lot of information about Kafka. Because Kafka environment variables, there are many environment variables in Kafka. You have to use this and you need to know a majority of these environment variables. At least as and when required, you should be able to understand these environment variables. It's very, very imperative with respect to Kafka. Cluster ID is a random, it's not a random ID, it's an ID that you have to create. But I have created a random number and give it as an ID. It should be a unique identifier for the Kafka cluster. Okay, particularly this ID is required for care mode. If you're using Zookeeper and all, it doesn't care whether you give the cluster ID or not, but care mode, it's very, very imperative environment variable. If you don't give that, it doesn't work. Okay. Craft mode is what actually there is a separate controller. All the it is maintaining the quorum, it is maintaining the electing the leader and follower. It is it ensure that all the brokers are working, communication between the brokers, everything is taken care by generally Zookeeper. The entire metadata of the cluster is maintained by Zookeeper. Instead of Zookeeper maintains, we are using Kraft mode where there is a controller specially focused on all these aspects of Kafka cluster, which we call it as a Kraft mode. Raft, Raft is a conscientious algorithm. It's a Raft algorithm, right? So what this does is it ensures that all the nodes in the Kafka they belong to the same cluster. That means whenever you are creating a node or a broker, why they call it as a node also I tell you the separate reason for that. Generally we call it as a broker, but here the Kafka node is divided into two parts. One is called the controller and the other one is called the broker. I will also explain that, but right now let's be very simple. You understand some terminology here because of these environment variables. There are many ways to learn, Understanding the terminology and using it is one way, and then understanding, you start using it and then trace back and then understand do some reverse engineering and understand. We are doing that. So each node that Kafka has got, Kafka can have multiple nodes. That's how Kafka can form a cluster. Okay. Why I'm specially calling it as a node, why not a broker? I tell you the reason. Right now, understand that Kafka node, each Kafka that is running is a Kafka node. So each node should be identified with a separate ID. Here we are running the Kafka with one node Kafka cluster. So this is the node ID. Okay, this node should be associated with this particular cluster. So this cluster has got one node. Coming to the processes, each node has got either two processes. That means one is a broker. Broker is the very standard classic Kafka broker, which takes care of partitions, messages, replications, and then broker is the actual state machine of a cluster. And the other one is the controller. Controller has come recently with the Kraft mode. Okay, this controller. Okay, so if you take a broker, which we are talking about a node, which has got two rules, two processes, process rules. One is called the broker, and the other one is called the controller. Why two roles? Can I create a cluster with one role? Yes, you can create a cluster with one role as well. You can just create a cluster as a controller as well. You can create a cluster as a, sorry, not the cluster. You can create a node as a broker as well. But better to use it as broker and controller because resources same JVM is used, and then unnecessarily, you see, the more nodes you have, the more difficult it is to manage. So better to have one, but more complicated Kafka installations, formation, there may be some separate nodes with the controllers as well. Actually, broker is it is going to handle the producer and consumer client related requests, and there is a controller which controls the actual cluster metadata, leader elections, once there is any uh, fault tolerant, right? So if there is any if there is any failure, then the leader election may happen. If the leader is failed, leader election may happen, right? So particularly there are two processes, broker and controller. And coming to the controller quorum. So how many nodes inside the cluster are eligible to form a quorum? Why how many particularly we are telling? You may say that okay, there are three nodes in the Kafka cluster. Why you are especially telling that one at the rate of localhost, two at the rate of something, two, three at the rate of the network, and then port? Why you are you giving that? Because controller quorum specifies the nodes eligible to vote for the Kafka controller in the quorum. It's which is you want to give it as a controller for the quorum. Kafka controller quorum specifies which nodes are eligible to vote for Kafka controller in the quorum. Okay, because some can be controller nodes as well, some can be broker nodes as well. But most of the cases, we don't create two separate things. We create a node which can act as a process like a broker as well as a controller. Okay. So Kafka controller quorum voters, who are all the nodes that can form the quorum. Okay, that means which all IDs of that particular controller node can be part of the quorum. There is only one node which is acting as a broker as well as a controller, so there is only one node. This is very important thing. For example, I have a special nodes which are only brokers, which are only controllers. Then you need to specify that which are all controller nodes can be part of the quorum. Okay. So that's very important. The leader election and all happens based on what you give over here. It's not necessarily that there are five nodes in Kafka cluster. Okay, but three of them are purely brokers. Okay, three of them are brokers and then controllers. Separate. There is a mix and match. Then you need to specially give the IDs of the nodes which has got the controller and a broker, or only the controller. So what nodes are gonna form the quorum is very very important. So those node details we have to give. Kafka controller quorum is what actually. So listeners are, that uh, how Kafka can talk, how the brokers can talk actually. There are again, listening is two parts. One is called listening on the broker. Broker is generally for the communication between producers and consumers, and the second thing is the controller. What controller thing. So listeners, they have two listeners. One is called the plain text, which is for the broker, and the other one is called the controller, which is for the controller. The standard ports are 9092 and then 9093. Kafka advertised listeners is very very important with respect to here actually in Docker Compose. This one should be the IP address of your machine, your host machine. So how did I get the IP address? I went there. I went to my Wi-Fi here. I went to network settings. Okay. I got details and I got it over here. This is the IP address I put. Why this is very important is why this is very important is Kafka nodes can talk to each other internally because they are all inside the same network. But how the clients can talk to Kafka server, so there should be an advertised listener. How can they talk from the clients outside of the cluster to the cluster? So you need to specify that actually host IP address. External clients, how can they access the external clients? There should be an IP address. So on that particular IP address, for example, I am writing a producer. The producer and consumer can talk on this particular IP address in order to talk to Kafka. Okay. So all the clients can connect to the broker using this particular machine IP address. Okay. And the second next one comes talks about Kafka listener security protocol. We are not using any kind of security. We are just using unsecured communication for the broker as well as for the controller. So both of them are just a plain text. Okay, plain text, and then controller is also a plain text. So the communication is just a plain text. That's what I give. So how inter-broker communication happens internally, how the brokers can communicate to each other, it is also a plain text. Broker to broker communication also happens, plain text. How the controllers can talk to each other, internal intra-controller communication, which is also a plain text. It's a internal controller communication, which is, we call it as a controller, not exactly plain text, but the type is ultimately plain text because we are not using any kind of security mechanism over here. Where the logs should be stored, so all the logs are stored inside tmp kraft combined logs. This is the directory where all the logs are stored. So there is a pattern for that, we will see later on we will see that. And coming to the replication and high availability, replications are for topics. Once you create a topic in Kafka, because producers and consumers talk on a topic, once you create a topic in Kafka, then automatically you have a replication. The replication factor 1, because we are running only one node cluster. How do they know that whether something is replicated or not? What all replications are there? There is a special topic inside Kafka which is called underscore underscore consumer underscore offsets is a topic. So this topic contains all the information about the replication factor and etc. So one indicates there is no replication because we are only running the single node Kafka broker. And the transaction state is also very, very important. Transaction state means what all transactions are happening, what all the consumers, producers or consumers are talking on a topic, which we call it as a transaction state. And there is for transaction also, I think there is something underscore underscore transaction offset. There is some topic specially for the transaction. Okay. What is the replication set for the transaction logs? Okay. If there is a replication for the transaction, the more the replication is, it can withstand with the failure. Okay. So you can also have the replication factor for the transactions. Since it is a single broker, we are giving it as 1. Okay. That is for the transaction replication. And then the third one is transaction state for the ISR. ISR we call it as in sync replicas. Okay, in sync replicas. Okay, we have replicas for the topics, replicas for the transactions, and then in sync replicas. Minimum number of in sync replicas required for the transaction state log. Since it is a single broker, we gave it as a. So again, in sync replicas for the transaction, and then general in sync replicas. How many in sync replicas do you want is what we are talking about it. Okay, these are the, we will see more about that, but these are the basic environment variables that we have used. The most, so it's a single node Kraft cluster. Okay, Kafka cluster with the Kraft mode. So we are not using Zookeeper. The node that we have created, it acts as both the broker and the controller. So the networking that we are using is for the controller and for also the external clients. External clients can talk to that on the machine IP address. Controllers can talk internally using unsecured network. So we call it as a protocol, plain text protocol. Brokers can talk also on a plain text protocol. And then we also discussed about the minimal replication factor because we have only one broker, then it doesn't make sense to have the more replications. So we have given replication as by default as 1. Okay, that's what about the basic setup. We will see more about it once we start writing to Kafka. Actually, we can see more about it. Okay, this is what actually our Kafka is running right now. The Kafka cluster is running right now. Okay, yeah, this is what about the Kafka. I'll push everything to GitHub. I give the details of this GitHub in the description. I think you can go through that and then have a look at it. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.